In the absence of justice, what is sovereignty but organized robbery? Wow, that is a heavy, incredibly provocative quote from St. Augustine, right? And, it's the exact framing used by a Nigerian lawyer and activist, Dele Faratimi, to confront the state of his nation. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into an urgent, politically charged speech delivered by Faratimi. But we're not just going to give you a basic summary. No, we are going to strictly break down the philosophical and historical architecture of his message. That way you can fully understand the sheer weight of his argument. Let's get into it. Okay, so the source material for our explainer today is this deeply personal, fiercely intellectual speech that Faratimi recently delivered. It was actually at Chief Tola Adeni's book launch over in the city of Ibadan. And given the total freedom to speak on literally any subject he cared about, Faratimi totally bypassed the usual pleasantries. Instead, he launched straight into this critical evaluation of the Nigerian state. He wasn't just up there complaining about bad governments, He was actively diagnosing what he sees as a systemic collapse. To really grasp the weight of his argument, we're going to follow a quick four-part structure today. First up, the urgency of time. Second, the broken social compact. Third, state failure and insecurity. And finally, we'll wrap up with the duty to reconstitute. Section 1, the urgency of time. Are we thinking straight? Now, Faratimi frames his entire argument around the passing of time and even his own mortality to create this really immediate sense of necessity. To ground this urgency, he actually points right to his surroundings. See, having grown up in Ibadan, he uses the University of Ibadan as a metaphor, specifically calling out its motto, Recte Sapere Fonts, which basically translates to think straight is the fount of knowledge. Faratimi uses this exact motto to pose a really direct, almost uncomfortable rhetorical question to his audience. He asks, looking at the country they've built and the way they've responded to their challenges, are Nigerians actually thinking straight? Have they applied the minds they were given to their specific environment? Now, to answer that question, Faratimi draws a really stark contrast. On one hand, you have Nigeria's immense natural blessings. We're talking about a climate that allows for 3 to 4 planting cycles a single year, and weather so favorable you don't even need seasonal winter clothes. But then, against all of this environmental abundance, the reality of human management is defined by these deep, systemic political and economic struggles. He argues that this severe mismatch completely repudiates the very idea that they're acting as thinking beings. Moving on to Section 2, the broken social compact. From citizens to victims. So having established this urgent need to, think straight, Faratimi elevates his argument right into the realm of classical political science. To do this, he brings up social compact theory. If you're familiar, it's essentially the foundational concept of the modern state. Faratimi specifically references the philosopher Thomas Hobbes, noting that because life in a pure state of nature is nasty, short, and brutish, human beings formed states to offer protection. And in exchange, citizens owe certain duties to that state. Makes sense, right? But here's the kicker. Faratimi argues that in its most primary, absolutely fundamental duty, the security of lives and properties, the Nigerian state has woefully and completely failed. Let's actually map his logic out here, because it builds in 3 distinct steps. Step 1, the state fails to uphold its end of the bargain. Now, when this happens, Faratimi brings in Jean-Jacques Rousseau, arguing that step 2 is immediately triggered, which is the duty to rebel. He then layers in Immanuel Kant, noting that recognizing your own humanity requires you to demand rights governed by law. But, and this is absolutely crucial, Faratimi stresses that rebellion alone isn't enough. That leads us straight to step 3, the duty to reconstitute. You can't just tear things down, right? You must have a solid constitutional framework ready to replace what was broken. But before anyone can even think about reconstituting, Faratimi insists his audience has to accept their current reality. Because the state has breached this compact, and because the law does not rule, he asserts a really powerful premise. He says that when the law does not rule, you become a victim instead of a citizen. It's a heavy thought. He states that a citizen's rights can literally only be upheld in a state ruled by law. Without that baseline protection, well, the title of citizen is basically just a mirage. Which brings us to Section 3, State Failure and Insecurity, the Evidence of Collapse. Now Faratimi knows philosophical theories aren't enough on their own, so he pivots to the tangible realities on the ground to prove that this social compact is entirely broken. He shares some pretty harrowing specific anecdotes of insecurity to make his point. For instance, he notes that the state cannot even protect its own command-level staff, pointing to the ambush and killing of a brigadier general at a base in Beni Sheikh. Furthermore, he really highlights the daily fear of the ordinary person. He mentions that simply traveling the short distance between Lagos and Ibadan requires citizens to, as he puts it, say prayers and speak in tongues, essentially treating a standard commute like you're going to war. Finally, he points out that the state simply no longer holds a monopoly on force. Instead, militants, bandits, and terrorists are acting as the primary wielders of violence. To really underline the sheer scale of this insecurity, Faratimi drops a truly jarring statistic: 23. He cites a recent American security assessment that explicitly classified 23 Nigerian states as critically unsafe, advising people to completely avoid visiting them. For Faratimi, this number represents a massive, undeniable geographical failure of the state's duty to protect. I mean, if 23 states are critically unsafe, he asks his audience, where exactly is the Nigerian supposed to run to claim safety? So the crucial takeaway here is how Faratimi actually diagnoses the root of this failure. He argues that Nigeria is no longer functioning as a proper republic, but has instead become what he calls a feudalized state. What does that mean? Well, he describes it as a highly centralized system existing purely for the benefit of the ruling elite, who basically just take turns extracting resources. He remarks that politics has essentially become a game of whose turn is it, rather than any sort of genuine system of public service. And this circles perfectly back to that St. Augustine quote we started with. When a state only exists to allocate benefits to a revolving door of elites, sovereignty is quite literally just organized robbery.
And that brings us to our final section, the duty to reconstitute, planning for the day after.
Now, Faratimi is incredibly careful to clarify that he is absolutely not advocating for pure anarchy. Rebellion without structure, that's dangerous. Instead, he's arguing for an intellectual, policy-driven reconstitution of the country. To illustrate this point, he uses a fantastic quote from Kwame Nkrumah. Revolutions are brought about by men of thought, who act as men of action. Faratimi uses this as a direct warning to his audience. Getting people emotionally riled up, that's the easy part. But if you don't have a concrete plan for the day after the system falls, you simply unleash chaos. And anarchy, he warns, only gives a decadent system the absolute perfect opportunity to just reinvent itself with new personnel, all while the underlying fraudulent system remains exactly the same.
So what exactly is his plan for the day after? Interestingly, Faratimi argues that Nigeria actually needs to go backward in order to move forward. He points specifically to the period of 1951 and 1952, which was a time of deep, rigorous constitutional conferences. He mentions the Lancaster House negotiations, where minority rights were fiercely debated and actually protected, which led right into the structures of the early independence era. For Faratimi, this specific era represents the structural, intellectual foundation that the country desperately needs to return to. And this brilliantly illustrates the core of his proposed solution, which rests on a really deep contrast. See, the 1951/1952 framework was built on the fundamental realization that Nigeria was way too complex to be ruled as a single uniform entity. Back then, it was regional and it was truly federal. But today's Nigeria, it's been completely stripped of that federalism, becoming that highly centralized and feudalized system we talked about earlier. His argument is that resolving the current crisis literally requires dismantling this centralized reality and returning to those carefully negotiated regional agreements of the past. As he wraps up, Dele Faratimi closes his address with a bit of humility. He actually tells his audience that, hey, he might be completely wrong, that he could just be speaking absolute nonsense up there. But then he leaves them, and by extension, all of us, with one final, incredibly provocative challenge. When looking at the objective realities of existence, is this normal, and must it endure? He is challenging every single thinking being to look at the hard evidence, recognize the broken social compact, and actually intellectualize a way out. It's a truly powerful call to move from being passive victims and to step back into the role of active citizens. So, what do you think? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer today. Keep thinking straight, and I'll see you next time.